When people study World War I for the first time, they come across this country called Austria Hungary, a country that of course no longer exists. Now when Austria Hungary is usually described, it is usually described as an empire in decline. The question though was Austria Hungary an empire in decline? Was Austria Hungary in fact doomed? That's what this video is going to explore. Now, as the name implies, Austria Hungary was actually two countries in one. However, it had a common foreign policy, a common military, and a customs union. At the beginning of the 20th century, Austria Hungary was one of the great powers of Europe, but it was on the losing side of World War I and was broken up into multiple countries. Now, many historians believe that Austria Hungary was doomed because it was this large, multi-ethnic state that didn't really seem to have a reason to exist. In fact, if you look at a map today, you will find that there are over 10 different countries in the lands once controlled by Austria Hungary. But I actually disagree with the historical consensus here. I believe that Austria Hungary actually had a great reason to exist, and for that reason, its survival was actually more likely than not. The reason becomes obvious when you look at a map of these successor countries. They're a bunch of small countries in the middle of Europe. Now today that's not a problem because we have the European Union, but at this time in European history, being a small country between great powers puts you in a very vulnerable position. The alternative to being a part of Austria-Hungary was being dominated by Germany or Russia, which is exactly what happened to most of these countries. There were also economic benefits. This was, in essence, a giant free trade zone. The wealthier parts of the empire had access to cheap labor and cheap commodities, while the poorer parts of the empire had access to good markets to sell their goods. Another surprising thing about Austria-Hungary is that despite the fact that it was being led by the Habsburg dynasty, the dynasty that had ruled it for over 500 years, it was remarkably progressive by European standards at the time. In the Austrian half of the empire, you had a democratically elected parliament with universal male suffrage, something that was not common in Europe at the time. The Hungarian half of the empire was less democratic and less liberal, but even there were signs of progress. I know that I've painted a pretty rosy picture here, but there were some problems that needed to be resolved. The biggest challenge facing the empire was the relationship between Austria and Hungary. You see, the arrangement between Austria and Hungary came about during a time of Austrian weakness. The terms of the relationship were also renegotiated every 10 years. And during each of these renegotiations, the Hungarians came with new demands, usually involving giving more rights to the Hungarian government. The problem with this is that it weakened the empire as a whole and made it more difficult to compete militarily with its powerful neighbors. So a big topic of discussion among the leadership of the empire was how do we strengthen the empire while weakening the power of the Hungarians. One idea was to create the United States of Austria, which would divide the empire into a bunch of different states broken down by ethnic lines. The empire would continue to have a common army, a common foreign policy, and a common market, but these states would be free to more or less govern themselves. The problem with this idea was that it was terrible. And the reason why it was terrible is that by breaking up the country into these little states, it was setting the conditions for its own dissolution. All you have to do is look at what happened to Yugoslavia in the Soviet Union to see what would have happened to the United States of Austria. In addition, there was a lot of intermixing during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so it wasn't really clear where these ethnic lines should be drawn. Now, another idea that I think was a lot better was this idea of trialism. The idea here was to take land from both Austria and Hungary and create a third state for the South Slavs of the empire. If this idea had been implemented, it would have weakened the Hungarians, but been very popular within the empire as a whole. Now, the Hungarians, of course, would have opposed this, but given that this proposal would have had majority support, and the Austrian half was stronger than the Hungarian half, it's not clear that the Hungarians could have actually stopped it. One guy who really liked this idea was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, someone you might have heard of. So those were some ideas for dealing with that specific problem. Let's talk now about some specific points of departure to prevent the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They all revolve around World War I. The easiest is to avoid World War I, or at least the way that our World War I played out. This can be done by having Franz Ferdinand's driver not take a wrong turn and drive right in front of his assassin. Yeah, it's really that simple to prevent that from happening. If World War I does break out, then just have it end a lot faster. If Austria-Hungary is on the winning side, then things are peachy for them. If they're on the losing side, then they just lose some territory but remain intact. If World War I lasts a long time, but Austria-Hungary is on the winning side, then they survive. If World War I lasts a long time, but Austria-Hungary is on the losing side, then things get more dicey for the empire. Something to keep in mind is that in our timeline, Austria-Hungary endured massive casualties, military defeat, and near famine, but they managed to survive until the very end of the war. I think that speaks to the strength of the empire and goes against the folks who say that Austria-Hungary was an empire in decline. Just look at what happened next door in Russia, which descended into civil war while they were on the winning side of the war. The bottom line is that if Austria-Hungary can get through the treacherous 1910s, then not only is it going to survive, but I believe it is likely to thrive. In addition to its good economic prospects, look at all the great scientists and cultural icons that came out of the territory once controlled by Austria-Hungary. So for all these reasons, I am personally bullish on Austria-Hungary, but I would love to hear what you think. Please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more videos like this, click the subscribe button. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.